down to its root system. It's and I can't tell you how many times I've seen this. And there's a real giveaway. When a plant's gotten really too dry, the soil kind of shrinks away from the side of the pot. And people will bring in a plant that's obviously, just totally shriveled, and the soil ball's shrunk. They'll say, "You haven't been watering this plant enough." And they say, "I water it every day." But they're just putting such a little bit of water on that it's not doing it any good. It's so hard, and you guys are such a good group of people. I can teasingly tell you things that I do periodically. People don't want to admit that they're wrong. And that's just, I think, just a part of our society these days. And it's really hard sometimes to get an honest answer out of people when they bring in a plant with a problem and you're trying to figure out, what's wrong with it. They're going to say anything they think you want to hear. And, well, have you been watering this plant frequently? Oh, yes, yes, yes. And have you had it in lots and lots of light? Oh, yes, yes, yes. And you can look at the plant and tell that it's not true. So I'll warn you, if you bring in a plant with a problem, I'm not going to play that game. I'm going to get an honest answer. Because I have been known to take a plant like a ficus tree that's a very bright light plant that wants plenty of moisture, and somebody brings in this thing, and I'll look at them really seriously and say, "Gosh, have you been keeping this plant in a fairly dark place and letting it get really dry between waterings?" And they think that's the right answer. So they say, "Yes, I have." And say, "Well, that's the problem. They want to be in a bright place with lots and lots of moisture." So anyway, fun things that we go through. But water doesn't kill anything. Lack of oxygen is what kills things. And when something stays saturated with water, it drives the oxygen out of the soil, and the plant's root system starts to die. It's not dying from the water, it's dying from the lack of oxygen. If somebody took and stuck your head in a bucket of water for 10 minutes, the water didn't kill you. The lack of oxygen killed you, and plants are the same way. And this is why we have to let plants growing in soil dry to the proper point between waterings. So the way you water all house plants, office plants, whatever they are, the way you water all plants for that matter, is you water them really thoroughly when you water them, and then you let them get dry to the proper point before you water them again. With virtually every plant that I can think of that you're likely to grow in your home, you water it very thoroughly when that soil feels really dry on the surface, or when you stick your finger in about a knuckle deep and it feels dry, it's time to water it again. And if you remember that simple rule, you will never ever have a problem with watering. And you cannot water by the calendar, because the amount of water that a plant takes is going to vary. The amount of water it takes will depend on the amount of light it gets, it'll depend on the temperature, it'll depend on a number of different factors. And a plant that's, no plant is going to need as much water in the winter when the days are 10 hours long as it is in the summer when the days are 14 or 16 hours long. So don't try to water by the calendar. Don't buy one of these stupid little moisture meters either. I mean, moisture meters actually measure the salt content of the soil, believe it or not, rather than moisture. This little God-given moisture meter is the best thing in the world. When it's dry on the surface or about an inch deep, then it's time to water things thoroughly again. And that's really all you should ever need to know about watering. One other thing though, if you have a water softener and you're using sodium salt in it, don't use that water on your plants. Salt water is bad for plants. It's not real good for you. If you have a water softener, you ought to use potassium salt in there rather than sodium salt. It costs about 3 times as much, but it's a good water softener. The salt is not your big expense. But if you've got a standard sodium water softener, it's only probably going to be hooked up to your indoor faucets, or maybe even only to your hot water faucets. Go outside to the outside tap with your watering can and get the water you can put on your plants, because soft water will ultimately kill plants.
Soft water or salt?
Well, they're the same thing. Most water softeners, people put sodium chloride in them, which is table salt, which is seawater in effect. And so the water that comes out, what you're doing with the water softener, you're taking the calcium out of the water and replacing it with something. Most water softeners, people put the sodium chloride in because it's cheaper. And all you're doing, you're pulling the calcium out, putting the sodium in, and sodium is what burns your plants. if you use potassium salt in there, again, most water softeners don't use, I'm not going to do a water softener commercial, but Kinetico's the best one out there. But because they don't recharge on a measured time basis, they recharge when they need to. But the potassium salt, you're replacing your calcium with potassium, which isn't nearly as hard on you or on your plants. So anyway, be careful about soft water. The other thing is sometimes plants are so big that you can't move them outside to water them, so you can't really water them really thoroughly. One thing, and when Roberta, my business partner, and I first started working together before we had Shades of Green, we were taking care of plants inside of restaurants and office buildings and things like that. And what we used almost exclusively to water plants was ice. I don't know how many of y'all lived here long enough to remember Crystal Baking Company when they were over here on the loop with all those big hanging baskets up in the windows and everything. We're the ones that were in there on the ladders 2 days a week watering them, and all we were watering them with was ice, because the ice melts so slowly, it's virtually all absorbed by the soil. Whereas if you just poured water on there, it would drip through and make Mr. Friesenhahn very unhappy. So we water with ice. And ice is still a great way to water plants, but again, hopefully your ice machine's not hooked up to a water softener. If so, you need to use just clear tap water periodically and flush all that salt out. But watering's important, but it is not really that difficult. Now,
what about the hard water, or what about all the minerals that are in the water around here? They won't hurt plants?
That's the water that's going on until you buy the plant. That's the water they grew up on. Believe me, no grower, we have some very good growers in this area. They don't have RO systems or anything like that. They're getting that good old hard, hill country water. And so it's not going to make any difference once you get them home. Light and water are related. Light is the engine, so to speak, that draws water through a plant. And a lot of times a good way to judge whether or not a plant's getting enough light is how fast it's using the water. If you have a house plant and it's just not drying out, it's not getting enough sunlight. And if your plants are not drying to the point that they need to be watered at least every 2 weeks, that plant's not getting enough light. Don't wait for it to start looking bad. That'll be as good an indication as there is. And that's just always a real good test. And I'll have people come in and say, my plants just don't ever need water. They're just staying waterlogged. Well, they're not getting enough light, because the way that water is lost out of that pot is not through evaporation on the surface of the soil. It's through water being taken up by the plant and lost out through the leaves of the plant. That's where the water goes. It doesn't evaporate. And if your plant's not getting enough light, then it's not drawing the water through the plant the way that it should. Does that make sense? I'm telling you kind of the science behind this, because I think if you understand that, you'll do a whole lot better job of taking care of your plants. Jason?
You said that usually 90% of the roots are at the very bottom.
Mm-hmm.
In that case, what's your opinion on the self-watering containers that have the reservoir at the bottom?
They don't work very well for the most part. They wick water up, and if you have just the right kind of soil and you have a fairly tolerant plant in there, they may do okay, but indoors, I don't know anybody that's really been successful with them for a real long period of time. You're better off just to go with a watering can, a saucer underneath the plant, and sometimes a turkey baster. If you can't move the plant and you get too much water on there, it's great to have a saucer underneath the plant, and when you water, don't worry if some water is standing in that saucer afterwards. If it's still there 2 hours later, yeah, you need to get rid of it. But with our soils, many times the water runs through and collects in the saucer, but then the soil sort of pulls it back up like a sponge. And don't worry unless there's water in the saucer 2-3 hours after you get through watering. If that's the case, you take that turkey baster and suck it out of there. But now we got 99% of the problems covered between proper light and proper watering. A healthy houseplant just is not going to have many insect problems, and if you take care of the light and the water, very unlikely that you're going to see much in the way of problems. There are a few plants that are more susceptible to problems than others, and one of the common pests that we have inside is not an insect, it's actually a mite, but the red spider mite can be a problem on palms, can be a problem on some dracaenas, can be a problem